The winter wind cut through the empty streets of Seoul like a knife. Daewon pulled his coat tighter around his body as he walked home from another long shift at the convenience store. His feet hurt, his back ached, and his stomach growled despite the cheap kimbap he had eaten hours ago. The year was 2157, and even though humanity had made contact with aliens 5 years ago, life for people like Daewon had not changed much. He still worked 12-hour shifts for barely enough money to pay rent. The alley behind his apartment building was dark and quiet. Daewon usually took this shortcut because it saved him 5 minutes of walking. Tonight he heard something strange. A soft whimpering sound came from behind the large dumpsters. He stopped walking and listened carefully. The sound came again like a child crying but trying to stay quiet. Daewon approached the dumpsters slowly. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. Behind the rusty metal containers, he saw a small figure huddled against the wall. It was a child, but not a human child. Her skin glowed faintly in the darkness with a pale blue light. Her hair was silver and seemed to move on its own like underwater seaweed. Her eyes were violet and filled with tears. She wore only a thin piece of cloth that looked like it had been torn. She was shaking violently from the cold. The child looked at Daewon with pure terror in her eyes. She tried to press herself further into the wall as if she wanted to disappear. Daewon raised his hand slowly to show he meant no harm. He had seen a few aliens on the news and in government buildings, but never one so young or so scared. Without thinking too much about it, Daewon took off his coat. It was the only winter coat he owned. He had bought it 3 years ago from a second-hand shop. The zipper was broken and there were patches on the elbows, but it was warm. He stepped closer to the child, moving very slowly so he would not frighten her more. She watched him with wide eyes as he gently placed the coat around her small shoulders. The coat was far too big for her. It swallowed her tiny frame completely. But Daewon wrapped it around her carefully and pulled the hood over her silver hair. The child stopped shaking quite so badly. She looked up at him with confusion in her violet eyes, as if she could not understand why he was helping her. Daewon pulled out his old translation device from his pocket. It was a cheap model from before first contact, and it barely worked anymore. He pointed it at the child and pressed the button. The device made a crackling sound and displayed broken text on its small screen. He could only make out a few words. Her name seemed to be Hana, or at least that was what the device showed him. He tried to ask her questions. Where were her parents? How did she get here? Was she hurt? But the translation device was too old and broken to handle her language properly. She spoke in a musical voice that sounded like wind chimes, but the device only produced static and fragments of words. Daewon looked at the child shivering in his coat. He looked up at the dark winter sky. He thought about the warm convenience store where he worked, but it was closed now. He thought about calling the police, but he had heard stories about how the authorities treated aliens who were found without proper papers. He made a decision. He gestured for Hana to follow him. She hesitated, pulling the coat tighter around herself. Daewon smiled and made walking motions with his fingers. He pointed to the building nearby and made a sleeping gesture with his hands pressed together under his cheek. The child seemed to understand. Slowly, she stood up on shaky legs and followed him. Daewon's apartment was tiny. It was barely larger than a closet. There was a small bed, a desk with his old computer, a mini fridge, and a bathroom so small that he had to stand sideways to close the door. But it was warm. He turned on the heater, which made a loud rattling sound but did blow hot air. Hana stood in the middle of the room, looking around with wonder. She seemed fascinated by everything. The electric light, the heater, the poster of mountains on his wall. Daewon opened his mini fridge and found some leftover rice and kimchi. He heated it in his ancient microwave and offered it to her on his only plate. The child ate like she had not had food in days. She used her hands instead of chopsticks, shoving rice into her mouth so fast that Daewon worried she might choke. He gave her water in his only cup, which she drank in 3 long gulps. When she finished eating, she looked at him with gratitude shining in her strange violet eyes. Daewon pointed to his bed and gestured for her to sleep there. Hana shook her head and pointed to the floor. She seemed to think she should not take his bed. Daewon shook his own head firmly. He took his thin blanket and made a bed for himself on the floor. He pointed to the bed again and smiled encouragingly. Finally, Hana climbed onto the bed. She was so small that she looked like a doll on it. She kept his coat wrapped around her like a security blanket. As Daewon lay on the hard floor with only his jacket as a pillow, he wondered what he had gotten himself into. He knew nothing about this child. He did not know where she came from or why she was alone on Earth. He noticed that she wore a strange device on her wrist that glowed with soft blue symbols. She had not let him touch it or even look at it closely. Through his small window, Daewon could see the night sky. As his eyes grew heavy with sleep, he saw something that made him fully awake again. Lights were appearing in the sky. Not stars, but moving lights. Ships. Huge ships were entering Earth's orbit. There were dozens of them, each one larger than any building Daewon had ever seen. He reached for his phone and checked the news. His blood went cold as he read the headlines. The Empress of the Celestial Throne had lost her only daughter. Empress Yuri, who ruled over 40% of the known galaxy, was searching every planet in her domain. Her daughter had disappeared 3 days ago, and the Empress had sent her entire fleet to find her. Daewon looked at the small child sleeping peacefully in his bed, wrapped in his old coat. He looked at the news again, which showed a blurry picture of the missing princess. The description matched. Silver hair, violet eyes, pale glowing skin. Approximately 10 years old in human terms. He had just given his coat to the most important child in half the galaxy. And now her mother's warships were in orbit above his head. Daewon did not sleep that night. He sat on the floor with his phone, reading every news article he could find about the missing princess. The more he read, the more his stomach twisted with worry. Empress Yuri was not someone to anger. She had united dozens of star systems under her rule through both diplomacy and war. She had destroyed entire rebel fleets. She had made kings bow before her throne, and now her only daughter was sleeping in his cheap bed. When morning came, Hana woke up slowly. She sat up in the bed and looked around with confusion, as if she had forgotten where she was. Then she saw Daewon sitting on the floor and seemed to relax. She pulled his coat tighter around herself and smiled at him. It was a small, shy smile, but it was genuine. Daewon heated up some instant ramyun for breakfast. It was all he had left in his apartment. He split the noodles between 2 bowls and gave the larger portion to Hana. She watched him carefully as he showed her how to use chopsticks. She copied his movements clumsily at first, but she learned quickly. By the end of the meal, she was handling the chopsticks almost as well as he did. The television in the corner of his apartment was old, and the screen was cracked, but it still worked. Daewon turned it on to check the news. Every channel was showing the same thing. The Empress's forces had begun searching Earth. Commander Tae-sung, the leader of the Imperial Guard, had arrived with 300 warships. Earth's government was cooperating fully with the search. Every city was being scanned. Every building was being checked. Hana saw the television screen and her violet eyes went wide with fear. She jumped off the bed and grabbed Daewon's arm. She was speaking rapidly in her musical language, and even without a working translator, Daewon could hear the panic in her voice. She was begging him for something. He thought he understood. She did not want to be found. Daewon held up his hands and spoke in a calm voice. He did not know if she could understand his words, but maybe she would understand his tone. He told her she was safe here. He would not tell anyone where she was. He would protect her. Hana looked into his eyes for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She seemed to trust him. For 3 days they hid in his tiny apartment. Daewon called in sick to work, which meant he would not get paid, but he could not leave Hana alone. Each day the search grew closer. He could see military vehicles on the streets below. He could hear aircraft flying overhead. The news showed Commander Tae-sung giving press conferences, assuring everyone that the princess would be found soon. During those 3 days, something unexpected happened. Daewon and Hana became friends. Without a working translator, they had to communicate in other ways. Daewon taught her simple Korean words by pointing at objects and saying their names. Hana was incredibly smart. She learned new words after hearing them only once or twice. By the 2nd day, she could say basic sentences. By the 3rd day, they could have simple conversations. Daewon showed her his old video games. Hana had never seen anything like them before. She was fascinated by the simple graphics and the way the characters moved. She laughed with pure joy when she made her character jump. It was the first time Daewon had heard her laugh. The sound was like music, bright and clear and full of happiness. He shared his meals with her even though he did not have much food. They ate ramyun together, sitting on the floor in front of the television. He taught her about Korean food and culture. She taught him words from her own language. She told him that in her world, there were oceans that floated in the sky and cities built from crystallized light. One evening, as they sat together, Hana spoke to him in broken Korean. She told him why she had run away. She said she was tired of being a princess, tired of guards watching her every moment, tired of tutors teaching her about war and politics, tired of being a symbol instead of being a person. She said she just wanted to know what it was like to be normal, to be free. Daewon listened carefully to her words. He understood that feeling more than she knew. He had given up his dreams of being an engineer because he could not afford to finish school. He worked in a convenience store because he had no other choice. He lived in a tiny apartment and ate cheap food. But he was free to make his own choices, even if they were small ones. He realized that Hana, despite being a princess, had never had that freedom. He told her about his own life, about growing up poor, about his parents who had died when he was young, about working hard jobs just to survive, about feeling invisible in a world that did not care about people like him. Hana listened with her violet eyes wide. She said that she had never met anyone like him before. In her world, everyone either feared her because she was the princess or they wanted to use her for their own gain. Daewon was the first person who just treated her like a normal child. On the third day, something happened that Daewon had been dreading. His heater broke. The apartment grew cold quickly. Daewon tried to fix it with spare parts and tools he borrowed from his neighbor, but nothing worked. Hana watched him work with fascination. She asked him questions about what he was doing and why. He explained how the heater worked and what was broken. To his surprise, Hana made a suggestion. She pointed to a wire he had overlooked and made a connecting gesture with her hands. Daewon followed her advice and reconnected the wire. The heater rattled to life, blowing warm air once again. Hana clapped her hands with excitement. Daewon looked at her with new respect. She was not just smart, she was brilliant. That evening, Daewon asked her a question that had been bothering him. He asked why she had given him her coat when he had so little for himself. Why had he helped a stranger when he could barely help himself? Daewon thought about it for a moment. Then he said something simple but true. He said that she needed it more than he did. That was what people do. They help each other when they can. Hana looked at him with tears in her violet eyes. She said that no one had ever told her something like that before. In her lessons about ruling, she had been taught about power and strategy and strength. But no one had taught her about simple kindness. No one had shown her that the most important thing was not how much power you had, but what you chose to do with it. That night, as Hana slept in the bed and Daewon lay on the floor, he heard a sound that made his heart stop. It was a high-pitched beeping coming from Hana's wrist device. The device was glowing brightly now, pulsing with blue light. Hana woke up with a start. She looked at her wrist in horror and then at Daewon with tears streaming down her face. She did not need to explain. Daewon understood. The device had activated on its own. It was sending a signal, a distress beacon. The Imperial forces would be able to track it directly to this apartment. They had less than an hour, maybe less. Hana was crying now, apologizing over and over in broken Korean. She had not meant for this to happen. The device was supposed to stay dormant. She had tried to disable it, but it must have had automatic protocols she did not know about. Daewon stood up and looked out the window. He could already see lights in the sky moving in their direction. Ships were converging on this location. The search was over. They had been found. The door to Daewon's apartment exploded inward. It did not break or crack. It simply vanished in a flash of blue light. 6 figures in armor stepped through the doorway, moving with perfect coordination. Their armor was black and silver, and it seemed to absorb the light around them. Each soldier carried a weapon that hummed with contained energy. Behind them stood a 7th figure, taller than the others, wearing a crimson cape that moved as if it were alive. This was Commander Tae-sung. His face was hard and sharp like it had been carved from stone. His eyes were a deep gold color that seemed to glow in the dim light of the apartment. He looked at the scene before him with an expression that Daewon could not read. Hana stood behind Daewon, clutching his coat around her shoulders. Daewon stood between her and the soldiers, even though he knew it was pointless. He had no weapons. He had no power, but he would not move. Tae-sung said something in a language Daewon did not understand. One of the soldiers stepped forward with a translation device. The mechanical voice spoke in Korean. The commander was ordering Daewon to step away from the princess immediately. Daewon did not move. He could feel his legs shaking, but he forced himself to stand still. He raised his chin and looked directly into Tae-sung's golden eyes. The commander tilted his head slightly, like a predator studying unusual prey. He said something else, and the translator spoke again. He wanted to know why a human was protecting the princess. Did Daewon not understand that he could be killed for this? Did he not know who he was dealing with? Daewon swallowed hard. His mouth was dry, but he managed to speak. He said that Hana was under his protection. He would not let anyone take her if she did not want to go. The soldiers shifted, raising their weapons slightly. The tension in the room grew so thick that Daewon felt like he could not breathe. But Tae-sung raised one hand and the soldiers lowered their weapons. The commander walked slowly around the tiny apartment, his golden eyes taking in every detail. He saw the empty ramyeon cup stacked neatly in the corner. He saw the makeshift bed on the floor made from a thin blanket and a jacket. He saw the old coat wrapped around Hana. He saw everything. Tae-sung turned to look at Daewon again. This time there was something different in his expression. Not anger, but curiosity. He spoke again, and the translator relayed his words. The commander wanted to know what had happened here. How had the princess ended up in this human's dwelling? Daewon told the truth. He explained finding Hana in the alley, shivering and afraid. He explained giving her his coat and bringing her to his apartment because she had nowhere else to go. He explained that he had not known who she was at first, and by the time he figured it out, she had begged him not to turn her in. Tae-sung listened to everything without interrupting. When Daewon finished speaking, the commander looked at Hana. He knelt down on one knee so that he was at her eye level. He spoke to her gently in their shared language. Hana responded, and even though Daewon could not understand the words, he could hear the emotion in her voice. She was defending him. She was explaining what had happened from her perspective. The conversation between Tae-sung and Hana went on for several minutes. The commander's expression changed from stern to surprise to something that might have been respect. Finally, he stood up and looked at Daewon again. Through the translator, he said that Hana had told him everything. She had told him how Daewon had given her his only coat, how he had shared his food even though he had very little, how he had given her his bed and slept on the floor, how he had protected her and asked for nothing in return. Tae-sung said something that the translator struggled to convey properly. The device stuttered and repeated itself several times before finally settling on the words. The commander was saying that he had served Empress Yuri for 50 years. He had fought in 100 battles. He had met warriors from 1,000 different worlds, but he had never seen a human show such courage. To protect the princess from armed soldiers, knowing he had no chance of winning, was either the act of a fool or a hero. Tae-sung said he was not yet sure which one Daewon was. Hana suddenly spoke up in Korean, her words clearer now than they had been days before. She said she would not go back without Daewon. She refused to leave him behind. She wanted him to come with them to meet her mother. She wanted the Empress to hear what Daewon had done for her. Tae-sung looked troubled by this request. He explained that bringing a human before the Empress without proper authorization was not standard protocol. Hana stamped her small foot and said she did not care about protocol. If Daewon could not come, then she would run away again. Daewon tried to argue. He said he could not possibly meet the Empress. He was nobody important. He was just a convenience store worker. He would only cause trouble. But Hana grabbed his hand with both of hers and looked up at him with pleading violet eyes. She said he had to come. He was her friend. He had saved her. He had shown her kindness when everyone else in the galaxy had forgotten what that meant. She would not leave him behind. Tae-sung made a decision. He said that Daewon would come with them to the flagship. The Empress would decide what to do with him. If Daewon was lucky, he would be rewarded and sent home. If he was unlucky, well, the commander did not finish that sentence. He did not need to. Daewon understood perfectly well that he might not survive this encounter. The journey to the flagship was like nothing Daewon had ever experienced. They took a transport vessel that moved so fast the city became a blur outside the windows. Within minutes they were in space. Earth hung below them like a blue and green marble. Above them was the flagship of the Celestial Throne. It was not just large. It was impossible. The ship was the size of a small city, made from metal that seemed to shift colors in the starlight. Towers and spires rose from its surface. Lights glowed like captured stars. Inside the flagship, Daewon felt even more out of place. The corridors were vast and beautiful, with walls made from materials he could not identify. Other beings walked past them, creatures from dozens of different worlds. Some had scales, some had feathers, some had forms that hurt to look at directly. All of them stopped and stared when they saw him. A human. Here, walking beside Commander Taesung and the Lost Princess. They passed through security checkpoints where Daewon was scanned with lights and sounds. They walked through halls lined with guards in ceremonial armor. They crossed bridges that overlooked vast chambers filled with technology beyond his understanding. And finally, they came to a pair of massive doors that seemed to be made from crystallized starlight itself. A human woman was waiting outside the doors. She wore formal diplomatic clothing and had an expression of barely controlled panic. She introduced herself as Yunbi, Earth's ambassador to the celestial throne. She pulled Daewon aside and spoke to him urgently in a whisper. She warned him that the Empress was not known for her mercy. She told him to be respectful, to answer questions honestly, and to never, under any circumstances, mention that he had hidden the princess from the search parties. Before Daewon could respond, the massive doors opened. The throne room beyond was enormous. The ceiling was so high that it disappeared into darkness. The floor was made from polished stone that reflected everything like a mirror. And at the far end of the room, sitting upon a throne carved from a single piece of crystal, was Empress Yuri. She was beautiful in a way that was almost frightening. Her hair was black and seemed to contain stars within it. Her skin was the same pale glowing shade as Hana's. Her eyes were violet but deeper and darker than her daughter's, like the depths of space itself. She wore robes that shifted between colors Daewon had no names for. Around her stood representatives from dozens of worlds, all watching with intense interest. Hana broke free from the guards and ran across the throne room. She ran to her mother and threw her arms around her. For just a moment, the Empress's cold, regal expression softened. She held her daughter tightly, and Daewon could see genuine relief and love on her face. But then Yuri's eyes lifted and locked onto Daewon, and her expression turned cold again. It was a look that could freeze suns. She spoke, and her voice filled the entire chamber without her needing to raise it. She wanted to know who this human was and why he was in her throne room. The silence in the throne room was absolute. Every eye was on Daewon as he stood before Empress Yuri. He could feel the weight of their stares like physical pressure. His legs wanted to collapse beneath him. His heart was beating so fast he thought it might burst. But he forced himself to stand straight. He had faced down Taesung's soldiers to protect Hana. He would face down her mother, too. The Empress spoke again, and this time a translator device near the throne rendered her words into Korean. She demanded to know why he had hidden her daughter from the search parties. The entire court seemed to lean forward, waiting for his answer. Daewon could see that they expected him to beg for mercy or make excuses. But he had promised himself he would tell the truth no matter what happened. He explained that he had found Hana cold and alone in an alley behind his apartment. He had not known who she was at first. All he saw was a child who needed help. So he gave her his coat and took her to his home. By the time he realized she might be the missing princess, she had begged him not to turn her in. She was terrified of being found. So he had made a choice to protect her, even knowing it might be wrong. The Empress's expression did not change. She asked him if he understood the severity of his actions. Did he know that she had been prepared to search every corner of every world in her domain to find her daughter? That she had mobilized fleets and armies? That she would have burned cities to ash if necessary? And this human, this insignificant being from a barely civilized world, had hidden her daughter in his dwelling and thought that was acceptable. Daewon felt sweat running down his back, but he kept his voice steady. He said he understood that what he did might seem wrong to her. But from where he stood, he did what any decent person should do. Hana was cold, hungry, and alone. She needed help. He helped her. If that deserved punishment, then he would accept it. But he would not apologize for showing kindness to a child who needed it. The court erupted in shocked whispers. Several of the alien representatives looked outraged that a human would speak to the Empress this way. But Yuri raised one hand and the whispers stopped instantly. She studied Daewon with her deep violet eyes, as if she were looking into his soul. Then she turned her attention to her daughter. She asked Hana to tell her exactly what had happened during the 3 days she was missing. Hana stepped forward and spoke in her musical language. The translator rendered her words for the court to hear. She described how she had escaped from her guards because she was tired of being watched every moment. She had wanted to see what normal life was like. She had taken a transport to Earth because it was far from the center of her mother's empire, but she had not prepared well. She had not brought warm clothes. She had not brought money or food. She had been cold and scared and alone. Then she described meeting Daewon. She told the court how he had taken off his only coat and given it to her without hesitation. How he had brought her to his home, which was tiny and poor by any standard, but he had shared everything he had with her. He had given her his bed while he slept on the hard floor. He had split his small portions of food with her, giving her the larger share. He had taught her games and languages. He had treated her not as a princess to be feared or used, but as a person to be cared for. Hana's voice grew stronger as she spoke. She told the court that in 3 days with Daewon, she had learned more about true kindness and compassion than in years of palace lessons. Her tutors had taught her about ruling with wisdom and mercy, but those were just words. Daewon had shown her what those words actually meant. He had given up his own comfort to help a stranger. He had asked for nothing in return. He had protected her from soldiers even though he knew he could not win. That, Hana said, was real strength. That was real courage. The Empress listened to every word without interrupting. When Hana finished speaking, Yuri was quiet for a long moment. Then she began to speak, and her voice was heavy with old pain. She told the court something that few of them knew. Hana was not just her daughter. She was her only remaining family. The Empress had once had a husband and 3 sons. But there had been a terrible war 20 years ago. Rebel forces had attacked the palace. The Emperor and all 3 princes had died defending the throne. Only Yuri and infant Hana had survived. Since that day, the Empress had ruled with an iron fist. She had crushed the rebels and established absolute order across her empire. She had become strong and feared because she could not afford to be weak. Any sign of weakness would invite attack. Any vulnerability would be exploited. She had protected her daughter by surrounding her with guards and walls and protocols. She had tried to prepare Hana to survive in a dangerous galaxy, but in doing so, Yuri admitted she had forgotten something important. She had forgotten that strength without compassion was just cruelty. She had forgotten that protecting someone meant more than just keeping them alive. It meant allowing them to live, to grow, to experience the world. She had been so focused on keeping Hana safe that she had turned her daughter's life into a prison. The Empress turned her attention back to Daewon. She asked him questions about human culture and values. She wanted to know why he had helped Hana when he had so little for himself. She wanted to know what motivated humans to show kindness to strangers. She wanted to understand how a species as young and primitive as humanity had developed such strong concepts of empathy and compassion. Daewon answered as honestly as he could. He explained that humans were not special. They were not superior to other species, but maybe because they were weak and had so little, they understood the value of helping each other. When you have nothing, you learn that kindness is the only currency that really matters. When you are struggling to survive, you learn that the person who helps you might save your life. Humans helped each other because they knew what it was like to need help. The Empress considered his words carefully. She looked at her daughter, who still wore Daewon's old coat over her torn clothing even though servants had brought royal garments for her. She looked at Daewon, this ordinary human who had shown extraordinary courage. She looked at her court, filled with powerful beings from dozens of worlds, and she saw that none of them truly understood what she had just witnessed. Yuri made her judgment. She announced that Daewon would not be punished. Instead, she was offering him a choice. He could return to Earth with a reward that would make him wealthy beyond any human's dreams. He would never have to work in a convenience store again. He could live in comfort for the rest of his life. All he had to do was walk away and forget about Hana, or he could stay. He could become Hana's official guardian and cultural advisor. He would live on the flagship and help raise the princess. He would teach her about humanity's values and be someone who saw her as a person, not a symbol. But if he chose this path, he would be entering a dangerous world. Not everyone in the court would welcome a human having influence over the future empress. Some would see him as a threat. Some would try to eliminate him. Daewon looked at Hana. She was watching him with hope and fear mixed in her violet eyes. He thought about returning to Earth. to his tiny apartment and his minimum wage job, to his simple, quiet life where nobody noticed him or cared about him. It would be easier. It would be safer. But he remembered Hana's laugh when she played video games for the first time. He remembered her smile when she learned new Korean words. He remembered how she had looked at him with pure trust when she was scared. She needed him. Maybe not to protect her from physical danger. She had armies for that, but to protect her from losing herself. To remind her that beneath all the protocols and politics, she was still just a child who deserved to have a childhood. Daewon made his choice. He told the Empress he would stay. He would help raise Hana and teach her everything he knew about compassion and kindness. He would try his best to be someone she could trust and rely on. Hana's face lit up with joy. She ran to him and hugged him tightly. The court erupted in reactions, some approving, many disapproving. The Empress nodded slowly. She said that Daewon had made the harder choice, which showed wisdom. She declared him to be under her personal protection. Anyone who threatened him would answer to her directly. She also declared that Earth would be granted special status as a protected world, fast-tracked for advancement and trade agreements. This was humanity's reward for producing someone like Daewon. As the court session ended and servants began to disperse, one figure remained standing still. It was Jiwoo, a high-ranking official from one of the most powerful alien races in the Empire. He watched Daewon with cold, calculating eyes. He smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had just found a problem that needed to be eliminated. Life aboard the flagship was nothing like Daewon had ever imagined. He was given quarters that were larger than his entire apartment on Earth had been. The room had windows that showed the stars, furniture that adjusted to his body automatically, and technology he could barely understand. But what amazed him most was not the luxury. It was the responsibility he had taken on. He was now the guardian and teacher of the most important child in half the galaxy. The first few weeks were difficult. Hana had years of protocol training and political education, but she knew very little about normal life. Daewon made it his mission to teach her. He showed her how to do simple things like making her own bed and preparing basic meals. These tasks shocked the palace servants who thought it was beneath a princess to do such work. But Hana loved it. She loved learning practical skills that her tutors had never taught her. Daewon also continued teaching her about human values. They talked about empathy and compassion. They discussed why it was important to help others even when you gained nothing from it. They explored the idea that true strength came not from power over others, but from the choice to be kind when you did not have to be. Hana absorbed these lessons like a sponge. She asked questions constantly, always wanting to understand more. As the days passed, their bond grew stronger. Hana began to see Daewon not just as a teacher, but as family. And Daewon, who had been alone for so many years after his parents died, found himself caring for Hana like she was his own daughter. They developed routines and inside jokes. They had movie nights where Daewon showed her classic human films. They played games and talked about everything from philosophy to silly jokes. But not everyone was happy about this arrangement. Jiwoo, the high-ranking official who had watched Daewon with such cold eyes, began making moves against him. Jiwoo was from an ancient and powerful species that had been part of the Empire for centuries. He represented the old way of thinking, the belief that empires were built on strength and fear, not compassion and understanding. He saw Daewon as a dangerous influence on the future Empress. Jiwoo began spreading doubts among the court. He suggested that humans were too emotional and weak to survive in galactic politics. He implied that Daewon was manipulating the young princess for Earth's benefit. He questioned whether the Empress was making wise decisions by allowing this human to have such influence. His words found support among other conservative members of the court who distrusted change. Empress Yuri noticed these political currents, but she did not intervene directly. She was watching to see how Daewon would handle the situation. She had given him her protection, but she wanted to see if he could navigate court politics on his own. She was testing him, though Daewon did not fully realize it at the time. The crisis came 3 months after Daewon joined the flagship. Jiwoo orchestrated a situation designed to expose what he saw as human weakness. A colony world had been attacked by raiders. The law was clear. The raiders should be hunted down and executed as an example to others. This was how the Empire maintained order. Swift and harsh punishment for any who broke the law. But the situation was complicated. The raiders were from a species that had been suffering under economic sanctions. They had attacked the colony out of desperation, trying to steal food and medicine for their dying homeworld. They had killed no one, only taken supplies. Jiwoo brought this case before the Empress and her advisors, including Daewon and Hana. He asked what should be done. Under galactic law, the answer was simple: execute the raiders and reinforce the blockade of their homeworld. But Daewon could not accept this. He argued that executing desperate people for trying to save their families was not justice. It was cruelty. He suggested an alternative: investigate why the sanctions had been imposed. If they were unjust, lift them. Provide aid to the suffering world. Give the raiders a chance to work off their debt through community service rather than death. Jiwoo pounced on this suggestion. He declared that this was exactly why humans were unfit for galactic leadership. They were too soft, too emotional, too willing to excuse criminal behavior. If the Empire followed Daewon's advice, it would be seen as weak. Other colonies would be attacked. Order would collapse. The only way to maintain an empire was through strength and fear, not through compassion that criminals would see as weakness. The court erupted in debate. Many agreed with Jiwoo. Some supported Daewon. Empress Yuri listened to all sides but said nothing. She wanted to see how this would resolve. Hana looked at Daewon with worry in her violet eyes. She wanted to support him, but she did not know how. Daewon realized that he was in a trap. If he backed down, he would prove Jiwoo right. Humans were too weak for this world. But if he pushed forward with his compassionate approach, he might cause real harm to the Empire's stability. He needed a third option. He needed to show that compassion and strength were not opposites. He requested permission to lead a small team to the raiders' homeworld. He would go there himself, assess the situation, and report back. If the sanctions were unjust, they should be lifted. If the raiders were truly criminals who would strike again, then punishment would be appropriate. But the Empire should at least investigate before executing people. Judge them based on facts, not fear. This suggestion caught Jiwoo off guard. The official had expected Daewon to argue from a position of safety in the throne room. He had not expected the human to volunteer to put himself in danger. Jiwoo tried to argue that this was unnecessary, but Empress Yuri approved the mission. She said that Daewon's willingness to risk his own life to verify the truth before passing judgment showed wisdom. He would go to the raiders' homeworld with a small diplomatic team. The journey was dangerous. The raiders' world was in a remote system far from Imperial protection. When Daewon arrived with his team, they found a planet devastated by famine and disease. The sanctions had been imposed decades ago for reasons that no one could quite remember. The original offense had been long forgotten, but the punishment continued. An entire species was dying slowly because of bureaucratic inertia. Daewon spent 2 weeks on the surface working with local leaders and the Imperial diplomatic team. He documented everything: the suffering, the desperation, the way the people had tried every legal option before turning to raiding. He also met with the raiders themselves. They were not criminals. They were fathers and mothers trying to save their children. When Daewon returned to the flagship, he brought evidence that could not be denied. He presented it to the Empress and her court with Hana by his side. He showed them what the sanctions had done. He showed them that the original offense had been minor, and the punishment had become grotesquely disproportionate. He argued that the Empire's strength should not come from the ability to enforce cruel laws, but from the wisdom to recognize when laws had become unjust. Then he made his final argument. He said that the galaxy was watching how the Empire handled this situation. If they executed desperate people for trying to survive, they would inspire fear but also hatred. Other species would see the Empire as a tyrant to be overthrown when the chance came. But if they showed mercy combined with justice, if they lifted unjust sanctions and helped the suffering world recover, they would inspire loyalty. They would show that the Empire was not just powerful, but also fair. Empress Yuri was silent for a long time after Daewon finished speaking. Then she made her ruling. The sanctions would be lifted. The raiders would serve community service rebuilding the colony they had damaged, but they would not be executed. The Empire would send aid to the suffering homeworld, and most importantly, she established a new imperial office to review all long-standing sanctions and punishments to ensure they remained just. Jiwoo was furious, but he could not argue against the Empress's decision. More importantly, he could not argue against the results. Within months, the raiders' homeworld began to recover. They became loyal supporters of the Empire, grateful for mercy when they expected death. Other border worlds noticed this and became more cooperative. The Empire became stronger through compassion, not in spite of it. Hana watched all of this unfold with wide eyes. She learned that Day One's way was not weakness. It was a different kind of strength. The strength to question unjust laws, the strength to admit when you were wrong, the strength to show mercy when others demanded cruelty. These were lessons she would never forget. Over the following years, Daiwan continued serving as Hana's guardian and advisor. The Empress implemented more reforms based on his suggestions and Hana's growing wisdom. They established cultural exchange programs between Earth and the Empire. Humans began learning from the galaxy's technology and knowledge. The galaxy began learning from humanity's resilience and compassion. Hana grew from a child into a young woman under Daiwan's guidance. She became confident and compassionate, strong and kind. She learned to balance the demands of being a princess with the need to remain human at heart. She never forgot the lessons Daiwan taught her, and she never stopped wearing his old coat. Even though she had closets full of royal garments, the coat reminded her of where she came from. Of the night, a stranger gave up his only warmth for a shivering child.